you. Igor and Ella, we never really discussed if you would do an introduction or anything. So since we didn't put that in place, I will just introduce myself and get going. And if you want to say something at the end or in the chat, that is great. So I am Carla Vermeulen. I'm the Deputy Director for the Institute for Disaster Mental Health. I'm also a professor of psychology. And what the Institute for Disaster Mental Health does is basically we train people to respond to different kinds of disasters. So we are operating out of a college, a state university, about 100 miles north of New York City. We've been around for about 10 years or so. And so we've developed a lot of trainings, trained hundreds and thousands of different people, both sort of traditional mental health professionals, but also now, especially during the pandemic, we've been training teachers and judges and librarians. And, I think we're all in the pandemic, we're sort of all responders now, whether or not we think of ourselves that way. But in particular, you all now are, dealing with the results of, or the fallout from the earthquake on top or in the midst of the pandemic and everything else going on in the world. So you are dealing with a very complicated situation, I know. And so we were happy to be able to respond to this invitation to provide some training for you. So throughout this training, we are expecting, let's see, it looks like we've got about 120 people now. So it's a very large group. That makes it really difficult to do much with taking questions by voice, but you are always welcome to put any questions or comments in the chat function. And I won't necessarily pause to respond to those right away, but I will try and respond to them, at points throughout. So please don't hesitate to post a question if you have one. And we will take a number of breaks throughout. I'm figuring, this is meant to be a 3-hour training. I'm figuring about every hour we'll take a 5 or 10 minute break because I know people need to get up and move away from the screen, and I will need to refresh my voice a little bit. I'm hoping that's going to hold out. So, but I will kind of just, plunge into it now. There's a lot of material that we're going to try to cover. Normally we do this kind of training in person, so we can do some exercises, some practice sessions. That would be ideal. We are not living in ideal circumstances right now, for sure. Hang on one second. Okay, talk a bit slower. I will try to do that. Remind me if I forget. I'm sorry, I do recognize English is not the first language for most of you, so I will try and slow down. I'm from New York. We tend to talk very quickly, so thank you for that reminder. I will try and slow myself down. Thank you. Okay, hang on one moment. All right, so just don't worry about all of this detail. Just wanted to acknowledge that this training is based on material that the Institute for Disaster Mental Health developed for New York State, for the State Department of Health and Office of Mental Health. So some of what this is based on is kind of New York or US specific. I tried to adapt it as much or make it as universal as I could, but certainly, everything I'm saying, you will need to think about and maybe talk among yourselves about how to adapt this for your own culture, for the particular resources you have, the particular kinds of disasters you are facing. So definitely, I'm not saying this is the only way to do things, but this is kind of the model that we have been using. So I hope it will be adaptable for you. All right, so our goals from this training, or the goals for what we hope that you will take away from this is, first of all, just recognizing how disaster mental health is very different than your normal practice. My understanding is that you are mostly trained psychologists, so usually you're probably doing individual counseling or maybe group counseling, but you have that understanding of mental health needs in general. We'll talk a lot about how disasters are just very different, and you need to really be able to kind of change your expectations so that you're kind of doing what you can and not feeling bad that you can't do everything for the people you're trying to help. We'll talk a lot about just the wide range of reactions that we see. We know there are some sort of patterns of reactions that we see, but always remembering that the individual that you're helping might not follow those patterns, like with everything. But we'll look at, what we recognize as some of the symptoms, the reactions, and some of the particular groups that might need extra support in disasters. We'll look at why certain groups are considered higher risk of having worse reactions, we think of them as more vulnerable for various reasons. So children, older people, people with disabilities, what is it about those particular groups you want to be aware of? We'll talk a little bit about extreme reactions like post-traumatic stress disorder. That is not the main focus of disaster mental health, or at least not treating that. Our goal in disaster mental health is to prevent people from developing those extreme reactions. But still, I'll talk a little bit about, what to be on the lookout for. And then a lot of what we'll talk about is psychological first aid. So I don't know if that's familiar to many of you, but that is really kind of the core early intervention when it comes to disasters or really any kind of problem or traumatic experience. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about taking care of yourself, the stressors on the responders of doing this kind of work, and what you can do to prepare yourself and to make sure you don't suffer, you don't get burned out because of all of the work you're doing trying to help other people. All right, so those are our goals. Okay, so to start with, hang on one second, I just have to fix one thing. Sorry, I have two computers set up so I can see what's going on. And anyway, so first of all, what do we mean by disaster mental health, and how does that differ from your more traditional kinds of clinical practice? So first of all, if you have been responding to the earthquakes or to other disasters, you probably recognize most likely you're not doing that from your nice, comfortable office or institute or agency where you typically work. You might be out in the field, going around to neighborhoods. It definitely is not the kind of thing that follows a schedule, that follows a routine. So you have to be very flexible, recognizing that, sometimes maybe you're talking to someone for just a few minutes, and that might be the only mental health support they're going to get. Or you might really get into a deep situation with someone where they're telling you their whole story and you're with them for a very extended period. So that takes some flexibility. And you're likely dealing with people who, they have been through a traumatic experience. And that means that maybe they are not just, trying to absorb the experience they've had, but maybe it's really making them rethink, is the world a safe place? Is God a benevolent God who is taking care of us? People really might have these kind of fundamental changes in their understanding of the world. And so helping them come to terms with that can be very necessary, but very difficult. Especially if you are working out in the field in a disaster impacted neighborhood, you might see things you find troubling, smell things, just depends on the situation. And then the next point is really important. Sometimes, there's usually not a perfect balance between the resources to respond to people's needs and the demand for those resources. So sometimes you might have more mental health professionals available than are needed at that moment because people just aren't thinking about mental health issues yet. Or certainly you could be in a case where, if you have an emergency shelter people are staying in and you are the only mental health person, the only psychologist or helper there, and there are hundreds or thousands of people. So again, just being able to adapt and be ready for that. And just to sort of stay calm in the midst of all of that. So, just going into this kind of work, recognizing you are going to have to always be changing and adapting to the exact demands. So how are you going to prepare yourself to do that? And just always to keep in mind, you know, disaster mental health, DMH, I'll use that just to shorten it. DMH is not the same as the kind of therapy you might be traditionally practicing with people. Your goal is always to, you know, we always talk about this in terms of a baseline, that someone was functioning at some level, maybe higher, maybe lower, before the disaster happened. They went through the disaster. That is now impairing their ability to help in some way, or to function in some way, because they're just trying to get out of this difficult situation or cope with all of the losses or whatever. And so our goal is to help them get back to that baseline, not to fix everything in their lives. You know, that might be something where after the disaster, they start to work on their relationships or something like that. Our goal with DMH is just to help them get back to where they were before, and not to judge where they were before, not to assume that there was something wrong with them, that there wasn't a disorder, but that they were doing the best they could, and that's what we want to help them return to. And it is very focused on those acute needs. This is not casework. This is not planning long-term goals. This is literally just who is there in front of you and what can you do to help them. So where are some of the settings this could occur? It really could be anywhere. You could be going into a community, a neighborhood where the actual disaster happened, or you could be at a shelter. I don't know if you use the same sort of emergency sheltering system that we do, where in a school or a church or something, you bring people in who have been displaced from their homes. It could be in schools, trying to reach children, working with teachers, supporting them, all of these different areas. And each of those is going to take a sort of different kind of place a different kind of demand on you. And, as we're seeing, like right now, we used to always think of doing this work in person, but now sometimes it's not safe to go to an area, whether that's because of the pandemic or simply because if there are ongoing aftershocks after an earthquake. So a lot of the work now is switching to telemedicine, over the telephone, over a Zoom call like this, something like that. So I'm sure you all have other examples of where this might be in your situations, but just again, to be aware, it could be literally anywhere. And then I'll talk about this more later, but just this recognition that people's needs change over time. Someone's needs the day of the earthquake are different than their needs the day after the earthquake, or the week after, or the month after. And so again, we have to be able to adapt to that, to recognize, what is the person's urgent need? And maybe their need is not to talk about their traumatic experience right away, but it's to just be given a blanket and a bottle of water and told where they'll be able to sleep that night. That's mental health support if that is their immediate need. So certainly just kind of recognizing, and I will talk about this again, these sort of patterns of how people's needs tend to change, making sure we are adapting to that, preparing for what the next set of needs might be. But all of this just really places a toll on the responders, because it's not just something that gets fixed overnight, but it might be a very extended response, as you are all seeing, I'm sure. And so, you need to think about just the basic practical things, but also being aware of the burnout, the vicarious trauma, those occupational hazards. Just wanted to make a note about the role of religion, and culturally this may be different in Croatia, but in the US, some people are not religious at all. Some people are very religious. And so just kind of being aware of how much of a role religion or faith has for a person, and that can be a real source of strength for them. But as we'll see, it also, people's faith can be negatively impacted by going through a disaster. But we have to recognize, for someone where faith is important to them, we have to kind of, acknowledge that, and ideally work with priests, spiritual care providers, clergy, so we're collaborating with them, because mental health has some things to offer that maybe the spiritual care provider doesn't do as well, and vice versa. We really want to collaborate with them and not be in competition, or not be underestimating how important that can be for people. All right. Dora, I do not know the answer to that. I will leave that to Igor to respond to. So this is another area where disaster mental health can be very different from more traditional psychological work, where it's not so clear that you have a client, that there's someone who you have that formal relationship with, where you are the helper, they are the patient or client, or whatever word you want to use. Throughout this training, I will generally use the word survivor, because this is, the person has been through a disaster, they have survived the disaster. And sometimes we call them clients, but it's really not that formal a relationship. So, but, just thinking anyone can be a survivor, you can be helping anyone. And, basically, we always say almost everyone who goes through a disaster will have some kind of post-traumatic stress reaction to it. That is not the same as post-traumatic stress disorder. We want to help them with the reaction to prevent the disorder. I'll keep saying that over and over again. But we also have to recognize not everybody wants help. Some people don't trust mental health professionals still. There might be stigma. They don't want to feel like, if I talk to a psychologist, does that mean I'm crazy or something like that? So not getting into, recognizing sometimes people just don't want your help, or they have enough help on their own. They have their family and friends to turn to, they have their priest to turn to, that is fine. Also recognizing that some people, sometimes it's very clear that someone is in distress, they're crying, they're screaming, they're shouting. It's obvious that they need some kind of attention, but always remember, for some people, they don't. They are, they're numb, they're flattened, or they don't want to show it. Maybe they feel they have to be strong for their family, so they're hiding their own distress. So just always, not assuming that because someone isn't showing emotion that they don't need your support. And, sometimes people just need a break, even if they're still dealing with their reactions or dealing with the consequences of the disaster. Sometimes they just don't want to talk about it. And, sometimes people ask, is it okay to use humor? And yeah, absolutely. If they, if that is something that they bring into the conversation first, you never want to start with humor, because some people will not be receptive to that. But, we need to kind of lighten the mood sometimes, to have that kind of, it's not all terrible. So, those are just kind of general things to be thinking about. Okay. I'm sorry, just looking at this comment. Yeah, the isolation, yeah, that is very much another example of that. The person who maybe isn't coming to the community center or the clinic, they are at home and no one is checking on them, and that is a very difficult thing. You know, how do you connect with those people? Do that community level outreach. I don't have an easy solution for that, but it's good that you are conscious of that. We are recording this, so we can talk to Igor afterwards about making that available, how to make that available. I know there's a lot of information in here. Okay. All right, so 1 second. All right, did anyone have any questions? I mean, that was just setting up what we were going to be talking about before we really get into the information. I will carry on, but just because we do have so much to cover, but if you have other questions, please post them in the chat. So this next section, I'm going to be talking about just the wide range of reactions we see over time in different types of responses, etc. Just again, so you know kind of what you should be looking for, what it might be easy to miss. So first of all, you know, I know that the motivation for this training was the earthquake response, but you deal with other kinds of disasters as well. So I'm going to talk first just about some of the patterns that we recognize in terms of the type of disaster and the characteristics of the disaster and these patterns of reactions. However, as I said before, you know, we always need to remember the person you're talking to is an individual, and they might not follow that pattern. You know, not everyone does. So just, you know, it's useful to recognize these patterns so you have a sense, maybe, you know, if you're responding to an earthquake versus a major storm or weather event, you're likely to see different kinds of reactions, or a terrorist attack or something like that. But always just, you know, I can't emphasize that strongly enough, always be looking at the person in front of you. So these are the main ways that we tend to describe disasters in terms of those relevant characteristics. So how the size, the cause, did we have a warning? Was it expected or not? And then when did it happen? So I'll talk through each of these in turn. So we can measure disasters' size in a number of different ways. So scope is basically how big was it? You know, what was the kind of physical or geographical impact? Intensity is more how bad was that impact? So, you know, if you have, well, earthquakes are a perfect example of this. You could have a very mild earthquake that shakes a wide area that people feel it. Maybe there's a little bit of damage, but not terrible damage. That could be very large in scope, but not as big in intensity. Or it could be the opposite, where, you know, it's only impacting a small area, but maybe it was very powerful in that area. So it caused a lot more property damage, injuries, even deaths. So often those two, scope and intensity, are related, but sometimes they're not. And then duration this gets measured in a number of different ways. First, how long did the actual disaster last? But once again, earthquakes, perfect example of this. An earthquake can last a few seconds, but that certainly is not the length of its impact on people's psychological reactions. Sometimes people measure duration in terms of until people, you know, until it's back to normal, until everything is fixed. But as we know, with large scale disasters, that can be months, years. It might never get back to the way it was before. So I think from the psychological perspective, the best way to think about duration or length is how long does it take until people feel that they are safe again? And with some disasters, that can be not that long. You know, if a storm has gone by, you know, if an attack is over. You know if a plane crash is done with. Earthquakes are very difficult in this regard. I'm sure you are all living this yourselves because of the aftershocks. It is so hard for people to feel like it is over when it really isn't. And the same thing with the pandemic. I mean, that is just, we don't know when it's going to be over. We don't know when we will feel safe again. So I can only imagine the combination of pandemic and earthquake. I bet everyone there is just feeling extremely unstable and unsafe, and having to keep your guard up all the time, having to be ready to respond all the time is exhausting. So that really, really, we know takes a mental health toll. So this idea of size, this is particularly important because this term dose-response relationship, you might remember that if you've had any medical training or anything like that. This is this idea that generally the bigger the dose of something you get, bigger dose of medication, stronger the response is likely to be. And that absolutely is the case with disasters. I mean, that just makes sense. There's nothing surprising about that. But just this notion that if someone has experienced more in any of those measures of size or duration, usually we expect that person to be at higher risk of a stronger negative reaction, a more long-lasting reaction, total common sense. But the research bears that out as well. So, if you're trying to help someone, you might want to get a sense of what was their experience like in terms of how close were they to the disaster? How long did it last? How long did they feel their life was in danger, et cetera? Because that's going to be a real warning sign that they might need additional support. And then cause is kind of the classic way we've always described disasters. Was it natural disaster, like a weather event, like an earthquake, or was it human caused, because of something, an action human beings did, whether on purpose or not? Usually people have a less bad reaction to natural disasters because as upsetting and damaging as these events can be, there isn't that sense that someone was responsible for it, that someone made it happen, except possibly God. So that again can make people question their faith or their religion. But generally what we're looking at is that people usually kind of accept that these events happen. It's nobody's fault. No one is to blame for it. And so there tends not to be as much anger around these events. People aren't looking for someone to blame as much. They still could say, well, why can't they predict the earthquake? Or, whatever, someone should have done something differently. The negative side to these events, and I'm sure you're seeing a lot of this from the earthquakes, is the sense of helplessness. We couldn't prevent it from happening, which means we can't prevent it from happening again, which means we are vulnerable, which means we are at risk of having to go through this again. And that's very difficult for people to deal with usually. Kind of the opposite for human-caused events. These are really seen as, someone should have recognized this. And especially if we're talking about intentional human events, someone doing, probably mass shootings are not an issue there the way they are for us, but, an act of violence that's intentional. We can, in many cases, we can say there is clearly someone to blame because they chose to take this action. Even if it was more accidental, still we can find, there's someone who we want to hold accountable. We want to get punishment. We want to get vengeance or justice. And that sometimes can help people if they do get that, if the person who committed the attack gets caught and gets punished, gets sent to prison for the rest of their lives, that can provide a little bit of comfort for people. But often that is not the case because the person responsible has died while they were committing the act. they're not available, they get away, or people just don't feel like the punishment that they are receiving is appropriate for the amount of harm that they caused. So in those cases, often what we see is people they have so much anger that they get very fixed on that. And that's kind of all that they can think about. And so they can't kind of move beyond the anger and start to process the event and start to adjust to what they've been through, start to recover from it. So that can be really problematic for sure. And then, as I just kind of mentioned, it's also important to think about, if we see something as human caused, was it an accident? Was it simply something that was unpreventable? So, maybe, a plane crash that happened because of birds hitting the engine, birds hitting the plane and causing it to crash, nobody's fault really. Was it negligence? So where someone didn't mean for it to happen, but maybe they weren't paying enough attention or they weren't following safety guidelines or something like that. Or was it intentional? Was it a terrorist attack? Usually, it's bad, worse, and even worse. For most people, hearing that something happened because of intentional malevolence, that's not surprisingly, again, the hardest for most people to deal with. The others, there's a little less of that element of anger and blaming, even though it is still a human-caused event. And what's important here, again, if you're talking to someone who has experienced a human-caused disaster or lost a loved one because of one, it's what their perception is. Maybe someone else would say, well, that was an accident. But to the person, it's no, the person responsible, either they did it on purpose or, just more of that sense that they should have done something differently. So that gets very hard for people to cope with. Then the next characteristic that we will look at is whether the event was expected or not. Did we get a warning that this was going to happen? And sometimes that's a specific warning. Sometimes that's more of a kind of general sense. You might know that you live in an area that can have earthquakes. So there's some kind of general awareness of that. Mostly what we're talking about here from the psychological perspective is something where you actually get a warning. You know that something is coming. So this would be more likely for a big storm, whether, the equivalent of a hurricane or an ice storm, something like that. Not surprisingly, it's usually good if people can get a warning because it does give them that chance to take action. In some cases, you can't stop the event from happening necessarily, but you might be able to get out of the dangerous area for it. So it helps us protect ourselves physically. It also gives people just that chance to get ready for it, to sort of have that, okay, this could be bad, but I'm not going to be surprised when it happens. So that's good to get that chance to prepare a little bit. However, if you think about most disasters and the kinds of warnings you're going to get, often that would be to evacuate, to leave your home, to go somewhere else. It's very hard, it's expensive, it's complicated. So very commonly what we see, even if someone receives a warning, is this sense of this reaction of denial, of no, it's not going to happen, it's not going to be as bad as they said it was. And then that's really problematic because once someone gets into that mind frame of being in a state of denial, it's really hard to change their mind. So we see this in America a lot where, every summer we get hurricanes and they can predict hurricanes so well now that, the meteorologists, 2 weeks before anything is going to reach the mainland, we know there's a hurricane out there somewhere. So people can get this kind of very long advance notice, but that often people get into this state of, well, they don't know exactly where it's going to go. So we're just going to wait. We're going to wait one more day, and then we're going to decide if we're going to follow the warning or not. So that is really problematic to change people's minds. So this is bad because if someone got a warning, but they did not follow it, and then it turns out that they had a lot of damage because of that, then that is very likely to cause a lot of guilt, a lot of self-blame, a lot of shame. And those, as we'll see, are really powerful emotions. What's worse than knowing that your family went through something terrible, but knowing that you could have prevented it if you had just listened to the warning? Then you could have at least spared them some of that trauma that they did experience. And to get to the next point and the comment. So unexpected events like an earthquake generally is kind of the opposite. There isn't that chance to prepare. And yes, helplessness, exactly. That's just that sense, very much like with a lot of natural disasters, because these events can't be prevented. Also, some of them can't be predicted. So just that feeling of just always being in danger, always being at risk. And your point, Sasa, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right, I apologize. But yeah, that looking for that warning, that's kind of the last point here. People shouldn't feel that guilt, but we want to have that sense of control that getting a warning gives us. So you've probably all heard this, people saying, the animals were acting really weird the day the earthquake hit. And sometimes animals really do. Sasha, sorry, thank you. Sometimes animals do kind of perceive, things that we can't feel yet. But so people are looking for those signs. Sometimes maybe there's some reality to that, but often there isn't. And people will really blame themselves. They will say, I had a funny feeling. I had a bad feeling that day. I knew I shouldn't have let him get on the airplane that day, even if it's for something that, totally unpredictable, like a plane crash. So just kind of being aware of how are people processing this. Are they blaming themselves for things that they really had no control over, no power over? Because that's something that maybe you can help them with a little bit. In terms of taking away, people often, you've probably seen this, have these kind of distorted beliefs or distorted interpretation of a situation. And if you can take away the distortion, then that might at least help relieve some of the suffering they're going through. Not all of it, but if you can take away part of it, then that's at least a step towards where you want to be. And then the last element to just be thinking about in terms of, what the person's experience was in the disaster was just when did it happen? So, some events happen in certain seasons. We have summer storms, we have winter storms. Others can happen at any time, like an earthquake. And, a particular factor with this is, where are people? If an event happens during the daytime, especially during the Monday through Friday, for many people, in some ways that can be better because it's light out. When things happen at night and it's dark, especially if the electrical power goes out, that is it's frightening, it's disorienting, it makes it harder to find and rescue people. So that's very complicated. However, it's more likely if something happens at night, it's more likely that families are together in one place in the home. Whereas if it happens, during the day, you've got maybe kids in school, parents at work or wherever. So that gets complicated because of course, especially if you're a parent and you're separated from your child, not only are you going to be very anxious about your child, but you are going to do anything you can to get to them, even if that means getting into danger yourself. So that can be problematic. And just things like, what is the staffing level at the hospital when something happens that brings a lot of people there? How many emergency responders are working? All of those different factors really can just kind of influence the experience people go through. All right, so that is our disasters, kind of those characteristics and those patterns of reactions. If anyone has comments, thoughts about that, please post them. But as I said, not everyone will follow those patterns, but it is useful to think about that. If I am getting ready to respond to an earthquake, I know that that was a natural event, so there's no one to blame except maybe God. I know that that did not have a warning, so people are probably feeling very helpless and very vulnerable. I know that there are still aftershocks going on, so they're not feeling safe yet. And this is an ongoing disaster in those cases. So just kind of having those expectations or that understanding can be useful just to kind of have a sense of what you are likely to encounter, even though some people might be different from that. All right, so looking at just what this range of psychosocial, psychological, emotional, et cetera, reactions might be after a disaster. First of all, just same point I was just saying, again, here we know these kind of group level patterns, but not every individual is going to follow those. Also, not only will there be inter-individual differences, so a difference between this survivor and that survivor, but also intra-individual differences, meaning any given survivor, their reactions are likely to change over time. And so kind of helping them understand that their reactions are likely to change, because sometimes people sort of get used to feeling one way, learn to deal with that, but then their reaction evolves and they start to feel a different way. And so kind of preparing them for that. It's also very difficult, if you are coming in as a disaster mental health responder, you are only meeting someone after they've been through this traumatic experience. You don't know what their normal functioning is like, what their typical functioning is like. And so you're seeing how they are now, but you really have no way of knowing, okay, maybe this person is being very emotional and showing a lot of distress, but maybe they were a very emotional, expressive person to begin with. And so this is kind of what we would expect from them. And in reality, if that person now, after the disaster, was just very shut down and very numb, that would almost be more of a warning sign that they were really in trouble. So it's just that not having that baseline to compare to, you're sort of, just trying to figure it out from what you can detect from them and their questions. So that makes it very difficult. And as I said before, we expect pretty much everyone who goes through a disaster to have post-traumatic stress, but that is not the same as post-traumatic stress disorder. So as I said before, we're trying to treat the stress to prevent it from turning into the disorder or clinical depression, clinical anxiety, et cetera. So I'm just going to show a number of different pictures in a moment. So just think for yourselves, and if you want to put it in the chat, that's fine, or just, for yourself, just identify the reactions that we are seeing among these survivors. And these are all true, these are from newspapers, these are journalism photos of actual survivors. So just think about these different emotions. And give me 1 second again to, okay. So I'll spend a few seconds on each of them. So just, identify, whoop, wrong way, okay. Okay, so a lot of different emotions on those different faces, right? Some people really in despair, some people, really showing their emotion, crying, some people looking angry, the little girl on the grave, grief, just, sadness to, just an intense loss on her face. I think this last picture, which was after the Haiti earthquake, I think this is so powerful in kind of demonstrating this, because you have, I don't know the actual relations among these people. I have this kind of story I've made up in my brain that the one couple, or that this is a couple with their baby, who are looking very kind of stoic, they're really not showing much emotion. Whereas the other woman who's with them, she is very clearly in distress. If you want, we can do raise hands if we like in this, but I am willing to bet we all recognize that the fact that the two of them are not showing much emotion does not mean they are not feeling just as much emotion, right? They just are maybe in a different state of mind. I sort of imagine them just as being so focused on survival. They've got their baby. Where are they going to sleep tonight? How are they going to get food for the baby? All of these needs. Whereas the other woman, she's having the feelings right now. I bet, those roles could easily be reversed if this picture were taken at a different point in time. So, again, it's just that kind of reminder that people are going to have a lot of different reactions, and it's not that one is the right way to do it or anything like that. But it's also, as I said before, it's very easy to miss people who just are not showing it. So just to kind of be conscious of that. So we always talk about disasters occurring in these different realms or different areas. So this is another thing to just be conscious of. It's not just emotions, but some people certainly carry their stress, their anxiety, their distress physically. We probably all have our own particular way. Like when I'm getting tense or upset, I start clenching my jaw really hard or tightening my neck muscles. Some people get a stress headache, a stomach ache, whatever it may be. But sometimes people don't even connect that as being a stress reaction. So kind of helping point out that, that is, maybe that, that people might say, I've had a headache for, since this happened that I can't get rid of. Well, just providing that education that is a way that they are carrying their stress. Also important to note, in some cultures, especially Asian cultures, it's much more socially acceptable to say you have a physical symptom than to say you have an emotional reaction. So that's another thing to watch out for. Certainly, people's behavior can be impacted. And, kind of two main ways this happens. Some people really want to withdraw. They avoid human contact. They just, it's almost like they feel like, having been through this disaster, they are now different than everyone else, and no one can understand what they have been through. And they don't want to try and connect, or they feel they can't connect with other people. And that is very problematic, because the most important thing for people in times of disaster is human contact, reaching out to your friends and your family members. And of course, now in the pandemic, that is exactly the thing we are not being allowed to do. So that's a huge complicating factor for everyone at the moment. But we certainly see that in more traditional disasters as well. Other people are feeling so vulnerable that, they are very needy. They won't be alone. They can't be alone. They just need to be around other people, which is probably a healthier reaction in general, but can be hard on the people that they are being needy with. And certainly some people will self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, especially if they had a tendency to use drugs or alcohol before the event. The emotional reactions, those are probably the most familiar, or the ones that we expect the most. But again, here we can kind of divide those into more internalizing and externalizing. So the internalizing emotions more like depression, sadness, externalizing more like irritability, anger. Anger is so common after disasters, and sometimes that's directed at an appropriate target, the person who committed the act or the people who didn't prepare for it appropriately. Sometimes that just goes back to that blaming. And sometimes another thing to be prepared for is sometimes that anger will get directed at you just because you are the person who is there. And that's just another thing. We've probably all experienced that, but just to kind of be aware of. But again, some people kind of go, kind of into themselves. Others are directing their emotions more outwards. Anxiety can kind of go in either of those ways. Then cognitive, these reactions, stress puts such a burden, a load on our brains that so much of our attention, so much of our mental resources goes to dealing with the experience that we often don't have a lot left. So people will, sometimes people will be preoccupied with what they've been through. They'll ruminate, so just not be able to think about anything except the disaster. But often people will say things like, I can't concentrate, I can't remember anything, I keep forgetting to do the things I need to do. So here again, that kind of psychoeducation, that this is a perfectly natural response because they're, so much of their mental capacity is just busy trying to deal with what they went through, that they don't have anything left for the kind of daily activities. And then the spiritual, I've talked about this earlier. Some people have a real increase in faith after a disaster. So, people will say, well, it's part of God's plan, or God was watching out for us, or, this, even if someone has died and they believe that they will go to heaven, they're in a better place now. People say things like that. For others, it's really going to impair their faith. So, how could God have let this happen? I thought God was benevolent. So, these questions are so intense for some people, because if normally their religion, their faith was a source of comfort for them, and now they've lost that on top of everything else that they've been through, that can really be, a secondary disaster for them. So connecting them with their priest, their spiritual care provider, that can be a really important referral basically to make in those situations. And then shame and guilt. So I mentioned these before for people who don't follow warnings. So shame is basically the strongest form of this. Shame is really the sense that something is wrong with me. I am a damaged person. I am just a bad person. Guilt is not quite as intense usually. Guilt tends to be more, I did something wrong, or I didn't do something I should have, or I should have been there and I wasn't. And then survivor guilt. If some people have died and you haven't, or some people have lost their homes and you haven't, it's hard to kind of understand the reason behind that. And of course, there's no answer to that question. Why did I live when others didn't? There's no answer to that. But just acknowledging how serious a question that is, and that's something the person's really going to have to kind of come to terms with over time. All right, so just remembering, we're not just looking for emotions, but we're looking at all of these different forms of expression that distress can take. And, that makes it really hard because people can be having, huge different combination of all of these different reactions. And as I said, not just the differences between people, but the difference within each person over time. So, basically just kind of recognizing that everyone is going to be dealing with some of these reactions. And that's why it's so important that we do provide support for everybody, which I'll come to in the form of psychological first aid in a little bit. And the second point, we used to use a phrase, I don't know if there's an exact translation into Croatian or, an equivalent for this, but we used to often say, you're having a normal reaction to an abnormal experience. I always tell people not to use that phrase, because if someone is feeling, all of those different reactions that I just talked about, and you're saying, oh, it's normal, it just can feel very dismissive. It can feel like you're not taking seriously how much they are suffering right now. So I don't know if the word normal in Croatian has kind of the same, almost like, like it's just like, it's normal, don't worry about it. But instead, I like to say, something more like, your reactions make sense. Most people who go through something like this feel in a similar way. And most people start to feel better over time. That way you're sort of validating how much they are suffering right now. You're normalizing it without calling it normal, so not making it feel that dismissive. And you're creating that expectation that they will feel better. Because sometimes people feel like, okay, this is who I am now. This is my life now. I will never feel normal again. I will never feel good again. And usually that is not the case. So we want to kind of create that expectation of recovery, but we also want to make sure they have the resources to help them if they either need help now or if they don't start to feel better down the line. So that's when we get into more referrals or interactions with you at this point. Okay, I will go through this next section and then we'll take a break. So maybe probably 10 more minutes and then we'll take a break. If people are okay with that. So we also want to be aware of kind of how these patterns tend to change. So this idea of a disaster life cycle, this is usually when we're thinking of disasters that have, a before, a clear during, a clear impact period, and then the after part. So that time when they are over and people do feel safe again. Not always the deal with earthquakes, for sure. So again, we usually think about these disasters as having kind of a clear period when they are active. And it is very common if someone goes through a significant disaster that they do kind of have that, I had my life before this happened to me and my life after this happened to me. And that makes sense. I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but it just sort of shows how significant these events are for people. So I'll talk about these different periods. And once again, here we have sort of patterns of reactions. Once again, individuals may differ from that. And so don't make any assumptions. All right, so as I said, if someone, basically I already made these points, if someone gets that warning before a specific event, generally everything is going to, make them want to go into denial about it typically. And so there could be that sense of guilt and self-blame. Basically covered this as well. We want to get those warnings. So if we don't, then, we're looking for why didn't we get a warning? Can I make up a warning for myself? That kind of magical thinking, like watching the animals, that kind of thing. But, main point from the disaster mental health perspective, usually there's not a lot of intervention going on pre-impact. An exception could be if you know that there's like a major storm coming and people have already gone to a shelter, you could have mental health there. But generally, we're not around for this part of things. The impact period, so when the disaster happens itself, again, usually we are not there for that because we are not first responders. The last thing we want to do is go to a place where we know a disaster is going to happen if there was a warning, and then become victims, become survivors ourselves, add to the burden of the first responders, et cetera. But what's really important here is even if you're not there for this period, but you're talking to someone after the fact, understanding how they viewed their own actions during this time. So this is really when we have the fight or flight reaction, the sympathetic nervous system arousal, you're focused on survival. Generally, people are usually fairly calm, and they're just trying to get through it. They're trying to get the people around them through the disaster. But what's really important from the psychological perspective is, how does the person judge themselves for how they acted? If they feel like they did everything they could, or a reasonable amount, that they made good choices, then they're less likely to have a really strong negative reaction. But people who are really critical of how they reacted, they feel that they were weak or stupid or cowardly, or they should have taken some superhero action they could not possibly really have done. That's another of that kind of cognitive distortion people often have, that's going to add to the burden of how they react to the disaster. And then most of our work, not surprisingly, occurs in the post-impact period, after the disaster is over with. We divide it into these 4 stages, and there's no real time frame that we give for these, because it depends on how big the event was, what the recovery environment is like, what the resources are, etc. So it's not like there's 2 days in the heroic phase and then a week in the honeymoon phase. It's a lot vaguer, a lot more changeable than that. Heroic phase, this is immediately afterwards. I mean, this is when, the earth has stopped shaking and people are trying to get out of their buildings and trying to dig other people out, etc. Basically, again, there's no role for mental health here. No one is focusing on processing their trauma at this moment. They are just focused on survival, helping each other. And it's always, I think, good to recognize, when we have that sympathetic nervous system arousal, that fight or flight response, it takes a while for us to calm down from that. So we have all those stress hormones in our blood, cortisol, adrenaline. And so often, yes, that's maybe giving people strength or energy they wouldn't otherwise have, but it also means sometimes we're not thinking as clearly. So people sometimes will get into danger because, they're trying to dig their neighbor out, which is amazing, but they're not recognizing how risky that physical situation is. So people, again, just are not sort of thinking very clearly usually at this point. Honeymoon period, we say maybe, because there is not always a honeymoon period. Sometimes there is, and this is the time when people are saying things like, we survived, we're gonna come together, we're going to rebuild bigger and better than ever, we're gonna be there to help each other. This is when there's government support coming in, non-governmental organizations, charity, community helping each other. And so it's this kind of sense of optimism, like, okay, this was terrible, but we're going to get through it together. People will say things like, yes, the buildings were destroyed, but that doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is we survived. So it is this kind of period of optimism, but it's often a bit kind of unrealistic. So this is really where, people are not fully acknowledging the extent of the losses, how hard the recovery process is going to be. And also sometimes this does not happen at all. I mean, if you have an event with a lot of deaths, a lot of destruction, you're probably not going to have a honeymoon period at all. This is a time, if it occurs, when it can be very beneficial for disaster mental health to get there, to come to an area, to start doing assessments of what the needs are going to be. So that way, even if people are in this kind of period of optimism, they don't really need the mental health support at the moment, you can get there and figure out, okay, let's get a plan in place for what we are going to do. Because, of course, honeymoons, unfortunately, don't last forever. And after this, people often get into kind of the hardest stage, this idea of disillusionment. And so basically this is when, this is when, they're really starting to recognize the full extent of the losses and realizing, okay, sure, we can rebuild, but Can we rebuild our entire neighborhood, our entire community? They're realizing maybe, I don't know if it's the same there, but that their insurance company is not going to come through the way they were counting on them, or they're not going to get the government resources they were expecting. And the media attention has moved on to the next disaster, and people start to feel they're being treated differently or unfairly. So this is really kind of that low point for a lot of people. And so this clearly is when disaster mental health is most needed. I will come back later in the training about what we actually are going to do here. And then the last phase is this idea of reconstruction. So this is basically when, people start to recognize, okay, we've gotten all of the resources we're going to get from the outside. Now it is down to us. Are we going to try and rebuild in an area that now feels unsafe to us? Or are we going to relocate with all the losses that involves? So all of these kinds of questions. And part of that is recognizing, no, it is never going to be exactly the way it was before. It is going to be different. Maybe it can be better in some ways. Disasters can be an opportunity to really recreate a new school system or a medical system or something like that. But that means accepting that we have lost the old way of doing things. All right, so just bringing this all together, this is kind of a chart that we often use to kind of just show this kind of emotional roller coaster almost. So people are kind of going along, feeling either feeling vulnerable, or they're ignoring the warning if they got one. The event happens. There's sometimes this kind of honeymoon period where people are really feeling positive, feeling gratitude. I never valued my life as much before. I never valued my community as much before. Then there's usually that decline to the lowest point as it starts to hit them of how hard the recovery really will be. And then during that recovery phase, sort of at the emotional level, people are kind of moving back towards hopefully where they were before. But you'll see, you see here, there are often dips in this. When the anniversary comes up, there's often a kind of reawakening of the traumatic memories and reactions. If there's another disaster, people often, really respond to that strongly. So it's kind of a gradual climb, not a straight line for sure, but it is the reality for most people that they do get back to their baseline. But we can help them do that by providing appropriate mental health response immediately afterwards. So just to sum this up, and then we'll take our break. This is not always a clear line. People skip steps, they can go back to earlier ones, et cetera. But again, just knowing that is a general pattern helps us kind of have a sense of what we are heading into and lets us kind of plan for what might be needed next. All right, yes, that's exactly where I meant to stop. So why don't we take, let's see, I have 12:12. Why don't we take an 8-minute break and come back at 12:20? We'll take a second break later. I just want to make sure we don't run out of time for everyone. So I will see you back again at 12:20 and we'll start up again. And in the meantime, if you have any questions or reactions, you can post them in the chat now as well. All right, see you in a few. Okay, hopefully everyone is back and you can hear me again. I did get a message asking about getting slides. I think that that's fine. I can get those to Igor to distribute to everyone if that would be helpful for people. Again, I know I'm covering a lot of material here, so, but yeah, I'm happy to do that. So now let's look briefly at what we do recognize as some of the groups or populations or characteristics that tend to make some people be at higher risk of developing a more negative reaction. All right, so we've already talked about this idea of the dose, the more exposure to the disaster someone has, not surprisingly, the worse their reaction is likely to be. We also definitely know that part of what is associated with a smoother or easier recovery is just having all kinds of resources. Financial resources, for sure. I mean, it's a lot easier to recover from something if you can afford to rebuild your house without a lot of struggle, or whatever, just repair the physical damage. But also, probably even more important than that is having that social support, and that could be just one person that you can really rely on to meet your emotional needs, or it could be having kind of a wider group of friends and family. And of course, the benefit with that is if you are totally reliant on one person, say a spouse or partner or something like that, and that person is not available because horribly they've died or been injured in the disaster, or just they have gone through it as well and are dealing with their own reactions and can't be there for you, and maybe you can't be there for them, that means there's kind of less of that network or that safety social network to turn to. And then what I'll talk about now is this idea of vulnerable populations. So very key to recognize when we're talking about these groups, it is not automatically that someone is a member of one of this group, and therefore if they go through a disaster, they're definitely going to have a worse reaction. It's this mediating relationship in the middle. It's that because they're a member of this group, for some that means that they don't have that kind of support system to turn to. For some, it means that they're likely to have a worse dose of the disaster because they weren't able to follow the warning for whatever reason. For some, it's that they don't have those other resources to help in their recovery. So it's those middle factors that actually place them at risk. And so that's a good thing, because those are factors that maybe we as mental health professionals, or just trying to figure out resources, might be able to support them with or respond to. So some of these examples, certain groups, maybe people, because whether it's because of their physical condition, because they're older and they've stopped driving, they don't have access to transportation, but for whatever reason, there are a lot of people in disasters where what we're telling people to do is evacuate, so you get out of the danger area. A lot of people need help with that, and maybe that help is not available for them. The conditions in shelters, again, I don't know if it's kind of the same there as here, but when we set up like a Red Cross shelter, I'm guessing it's pretty similar because it tends to be globally. It's often in a gymnasium, and it's these awful cots, little beds that are terribly uncomfortable, and it's noisy and it's chaotic. And so those conditions for anyone who has any kind of psychiatric issues or cognitive problems, or just is uncomfortable, in that kind of public situation, that can really compound the distress for people. Certainly, often people lose their medications or their medical devices, and that increases, illness, suffering. I think a good example of this is if I was in an earthquake or another disaster and my glasses broke, or I lost my eyeglasses, I would be disabled. And that is often the case. So people, often need assistance with that kind of thing. And then just people who had help and aid, whether that was a family member or someone paid to just kind of get them through the day, and often will lose access to that. So there's a million more examples I could give, but these are just some common ones. So what are these groups that in particular? And it may vary depending on if you have a certain kind of population in your area. So you always want to think about who is likely to be vulnerable. But these are kind of the main groups that are likely to be present in any culture. Certainly children. Children are small, they're weak, they don't have the fast, in some ways, the reflexes, and just they don't have the knowledge. How is a child going to understand how to respond to an evacuation warning or to, find safe shelter or something like that? So because of that, they're much more likely to be injured and or to not be able to get themselves out of a dangerous situation, which then increases the dose that they receive of that exposure. And then, of course, children also are so dependent on their caregivers. And that's for physical safety and protection, of course, but also social emotional safety. So if the caregivers are not there, or the caregivers are traumatized themselves and are not able to be responsive and to protect the children, that places the children at much higher risk of having their own reactions. So we often say, children are in the middle, and then the family, the caregivers can kind of buffer them, be like a protective layer around them. But if the caregivers can't do that, then the child will get that direct exposure as well. And also really important with children because I talked about at the beginning about getting people back to their baseline. Well, that's fine for adults where that baseline was established, but children are supposed to be continually growing and improving physically, socially, academically. Every part of a child is supposed to be growing all the time. If that growth gets disrupted, so if they were here, even if they kind of, go down, have the disillusionment, even if they get back to the baseline they were at before the disaster, that's not good enough because they should have been here now. So they have really been disrupted. And sometimes that can be permanent or very long lasting. I think beyond whatever is going on with children with the earthquake, I think we are all deeply worried about children's development now in the pandemic and, not being able to whatever this is, attending school, missing all of those social experiences, etc. And then we also really need to view children as part of that family system. So looking at not just the child themselves, but and really in terms of disaster mental health, it's probably more likely your work would be with the caregivers, with the parents, than with the child directly. So understanding, did they all go through this together, did something happen while the children were at school and the parents were away from them? Different kinds of issues there where parents might feel very guilty that they weren't with their children when the bad thing happened. But if they were together, then they are dealing with their own trauma as well. Just what was going on in the family before the disaster? Did they have resources? Was there a stable relationship? Did they have extended family and friends? Or was there disruption or stress or conflict already that's going to likely be made even worse by the disaster? And then just, does the parent feel competent? I think most parents I know are always questioning whether they're doing a good enough job under normal circumstances. Now you add the disaster, there's likely to be a lot of sort of self-doubt or guilt that they're not doing enough. So kind of addressing that with the parent, giving them the skills that they need. So that's the subject of a whole other training that we could do, but just to kind of be aware of that. So as I said, a lot of what we're doing with kids really is focusing on helping the parents help the child, because if we're there temporarily in a disaster mental health role, it doesn't make sense to set up a system where the child is turning to us as the sources of support, because we're not going to be there for very long. It's the caregivers who are going to be there in the long run. So we really want to focus on giving them the tools that they need. All right, then at the opposite end of the age of the life spectrum, frail older adults, and we always want to say, you know, many older adults are perfectly competent and aren't going to have any different experience than middle-aged or younger adults. So we're really thinking about people who had some kinds of pre-existing physical conditions, medical conditions, cognitive impairment, anything like that. Those are the ones that are really considered to be vulnerable in terms of disaster. Certainly, if someone had a pre-existing medical condition, it's likely that that will be worsened just by, you know, the stress, not being able to get treatment they need, losing the medications they need, et cetera. So that's always something we'll want to try and attend to as quickly as possible. And just to be aware that, you know, even if someone doesn't have Alzheimer's disease or full dementia, just, you know, older adults tend to think less quickly. Now that's compensated by wisdom and life experience, but they tend to be less flexible cognitively. And so if there's any kind of condition like that, that's likely to get worsened by the stress and by the, you know, just kind of the chaos and being in an unfamiliar environment. And so because of that, often older adults will know, like, maybe they can function okay when they're in their own home. But if you're telling them to go to a shelter or to move in with a family member or something like that, there's often real resistance to that. They just don't want to because they know they're going to have a really hard time adapting. And then this last point, you know, we talk about recovery with younger adults, like maybe it's going to be difficult, but that sense that someday you'll get back to baseline or a new normal, et cetera. Many older adults just don't have that sense of a long enough future for that to be an option. And, you know, they may be realistic about that. If recovery is going to take 5 years and you are 85 years old and in frail health, you really might not see that recovery. And so often, you know, it's hard to sort of encourage people to feel optimistic and, you know, just keep going, things will get better, because they know on the practical level, they might not survive to see that, which is obviously very unfortunate. And I don't have a great way of helping people deal with that. Just looking at the comment, children and parents sleeping together in cars. Is that letting children sleep? You know, as I said before, for parents to keep the family together, I understand why a parent would choose that rather than sending the kids off to stay with a relative in another place where they couldn't see them. It's really hard to judge whether it's better or normal or appropriate or not. But I think, you know, trying to understand from the perspective of the person making that choice, what are they valuing? If they're valuing being together with their child, then maybe that's something that should be appreciated, but maybe also hopefully getting them into a safer place. Okay, so just a couple of other points on older adults. You know, they do tend to have kind of shrinking social circles because their own friends, their own family members may not be around any longer, or they might be alive, but they might be geographically distant. I'm not sure if that's the same phenomenon there, but often here people move, you know, adult children move away from their parents and often move very far. So families, even if they exist, may be very separated. So there's just that kind of less of that idea of this network to turn to for support. And often what we'll see with older adults is just this kind of, no, I'm okay. You know, you take care of my neighbor with the young children, you know, they need the help more than I do. And sometimes that is, you know, it's genuine. So, you know, older adults tend to be incredibly resilient because you don't make it to later life without having experienced trauma, without having experienced disasters and knowing how to come through them. So I think we need to do better at recognizing the strength of older adults and recognizing that when they suffer during disasters, it is not because they're weak in some way. It's because they have these other practical needs, these medical needs. So if we can help them with those, then, you know, that's the best thing we can do. they probably have the psychological resilience to get through something. All right. There's a lot of overlap in some ways between the needs of older adults and people with physical disabilities. But this is a group where, you know, there's huge variety of what that could mean. I mean, someone might use a wheelchair, but be completely independently living and able to get around and drive and all of that kind of stuff, provided they have their access to their wheelchairs. So that's a person where maybe, you know, the only thing they need in terms of post-disaster support is getting their wheelchair fixed. Other people might have much more limiting physical disabilities. And that could even be things like people in chronic pain. You know, if someone has a very bad back or bad neck or other chronic pain condition, for that person to be in a shelter, incredibly difficult. So, you know, sure you can all imagine the different complexities here. And also, at least in the US, often people with serious physical disabilities have fewer job opportunities. So they might already be lower socioeconomic side of things. Again, that fewer resources, less ability to kind of take charge of their own recovery. It may be that people feel like they are a burden in some way because they need additional support, or at least in the US, you know, often people with disabilities are not well represented in disaster planning. So it's also entirely possible that there can be some upset, some anger that they're basically being not addressed, needs are not addressed. But once again, like older adults, they need practical stuff. They need the medical devices. It's not that there's any kind of psychological limitation with this group. Serious mental illness is more complicated, or potentially more complicated. First of all, we want to recognize if someone has a history of mental illness, you know, clinical depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar, you know, any of the big ones for sure. If they then go through a traumatic experience, they are at higher risk of a recurrence or a relapse or a spike in their symptoms, but they're not guaranteed. You know, it's not going to be automatic. And so it's very important to work with this group to figure out, okay, so they're having some negative reactions, but is that a sign that they're having a flare-up of the mental illness, or are they just having the same post-trauma reactions as everyone else? So it's like you want to be attentive to them, but also have that expectation that, you know, it's not destined that they're going to have a problem again. Depending on the mental illness, especially something like schizophrenia, where, you know, maybe there are visible signs of it, we definitely face issues around stigma in shelters, where, you know, people are just afraid to be around someone who is acting strange or differently. Autism, you know, people on the autism spectrum as well often have sort of behaviors that are not a threat to anyone for sure, but they can be kind of, you know, make people nervous. So that's certainly an issue where you might need to kind of figure out how to take care of them in a way that makes everyone feel safe, doesn't expose anyone to abuse or further trauma in that way. And basically in terms of disaster mental health, once again, you know, getting them back on medications, getting them back into whatever support systems they had as quickly as possible. And then the last group I'll just touch on very briefly is responders. So that could be on the mental health side, or first responders. So firefighters, police, emergency technicians. Certainly right now with the pandemic, anyone working in the hospital is a responder. So, you know, these are generally people who are not considered vulnerable. They're considered highly resilient because usually people in these fields, they have chosen to go into those fields. You know, it's not like a disaster that happens to anyone. People who get exposed through their work, they self-selected, they made the choice to go into that profession. But we still want to recognize that even though they tend to be strong and resilient and they've had a lot of training typically, still everyone has that breaking point, whether that's burnout because they're now a hospital worker who's been responding to the pandemic for a year, or that's one particularly powerful experience like a disaster, like a very traumatic response, or maybe it's something that involves children the same age as their own children, whatever it might be. We just want to make sure that we are attending to this group and making sure they're getting whatever mental health support they need. Often that's going to kind of come from within, especially like first responders get that more from peers or people who are trained or came out of that field themselves, but just to not overlook them for sure. Okay, so that was kind of the vulnerable groups. Just kind of, we're going to transition now into some disaster-related loss issues. But first, obviously you just want to always be as culturally competent as you can. My understanding of Croatia is it's kind of fascinating mix up of a whole bunch of different cultures just because of where you are geographically. I've never been there. I really want to go there. So someday maybe I can meet you all in person. That would be great. But, just being sensitive, being thoughtful, what are the historic dynamics between different groups, different faiths, all of that, because our cultural values tend to become very relevant for us when we are under stress. We turn to things that are comfortable, that make us feel connected. And a lot of that is based on culture. So just kind of in general, you want to kind of be aware of who you are dealing with. And as I transition to talking about death and loss, this is especially true when it comes to the way we mark losses, especially death. And this is something, we have certainly been seeing for the last year, that people are not able to have funerals. They're not able to come together during the pandemic. And that is just so increasing distress for people. I'm guessing the same thing happened with the earthquake-related fatalities just because of the timing of when they happened. So that just to be aware of that and how really significant a loss that is for people. Because it's not just that we don't get to get that support, but it's also that we feel guilty about not kind of providing that last service, that last way of honoring our loved ones. So please don't underestimate that. I'm sure you haven't, but just to point that out. All right, so just a few points about loss and grief, which in this sense, could be other kinds of loss as well. Mostly I'm thinking about deaths that occur during the disaster, but it could also be these other forms, just loss of anything that matters to us. And that does include these things more like our belief in God as a benevolent being, our sense that the world is generally safe, our sense that the world is generally fair, that, we have the saying, bad things shouldn't happen to good people, but of course they do all the time. So coming to terms with that kind of thing is really, really, it's another type of loss that we really need to validate people for. So a few points, we need to kind of recognize that especially in a disaster, someone might be dealing with multiple kinds of these losses at the same time. And that it kind of adds this burden for them. In the US, there has been this belief in the kind of the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. There are some strengths to those, but in my experience, it is not that clean a progression. It's like the disaster phases. Not everyone goes through all of those. and I often see people will be like, I'm doing it wrong. You know, I should be in the bargaining stage. Why am I not feeling that? So I think we just want to provide that education for people. It is not that clean a process. Everyone goes through it in their own unique way. It often takes a lot longer than we acknowledge, than we want people to bounce back even after a significant death in their lives. And so really just letting people know it takes a lot longer than expected. And this is this sense of this idea of closure, where you have a terrible loss, you go through a bunch of stages, you reach this idea of closure where it doesn't hurt any longer. That is certainly not how I've experienced loss and grief in my life. I prefer to kind of use this analogy that when a loss hurts so much because we've become attached to something or someone. And when part of that attachment gets torn away, it leaves a hole in us. Like I always use the analogy of two trees whose roots have grown together. If one of those trees dies, the other tree can survive, but it's never going to be exactly the same again. It's never going to be whole, but it can still grow. It can still move on and move into the future. So I think just trying to help people recognize that, we tend to encourage people to sort of not express their emotions around a loss. So just recognizing how big that is. And it's not just the emotional loss of the person, but it's having to reconfigure around that missing piece. So figuring out, how are you now going to raise your family without your partner, or carry on without your parent, or whatever the relationship might have been. There were practical aspects as well as the emotional ones. When it comes to disaster-related losses, it's a survivor may have made it through the earthquake or whatever, lost a loved one in it, but so they are dealing with that loss. And they're also dealing with their own traumatic experience at the same time, with processing that, what they went through, as well as that they no longer have the loved one there. And disaster-related deaths, not the pandemic necessarily so much, but almost always these are unexpected. So if a loved one gets a diagnosis of cancer or a terminal illness, that's terrible, of course. We go through anticipatory grief about that, where we know the loss is coming. That is incredibly painful. But we have the chance to, come to peace with the person, tell them that we loved them, strengthen those connections, reassure them that we'll be okay, make those plans, etc. That is usually not the case in disasters. So, people will say things like, the last conversation we ever had was a fight, or, I meant to tell him this and I never got the chance to, or, so there's often that kind of regret, and just that being, it being so sudden, just having no time to prepare. Again, same point I've made multiple times, if they ignored the warning, all that issue of guilt and blame, if they feel someone was responsible for it, that need for justice. And I won't get into this just for time's sake, but in some cases, if it was a criminal action, then people, the survivors, might need to get involved in court cases, criminal proceedings, and that can be helpful if they get that sense of justice, but it also just kind of keeps opening the wound up every time. So it makes it very hard for them to sort of start adjusting when they keep having to revisit the loss. And then this idea of bereavement overload. So, bereavement referring to the process of coming to terms with that loss. We're pretty good at dealing with one loss at a time because we have to be. I mean, life doesn't give us any other choice. But when it is something where you have multiple losses all at once, that just can overwhelm those coping capacities for people. And then also sometimes we see, people will say things like, well, I lost my beloved dog or cat, but I know that's nothing compared to what, other people lost family members. And like, yeah, probably comparing those things is, that's fair to say it's less bad to lose a pet, but you still lost your pet, or you lost your home, but not a family, all of these comparisons. So validating, giving people the permission that even if someone else had it worse than them, they still did have a loss, and they have the right and they have the need to mourn that, because if they ignore it or they, don't pay attention to it, at some point it's going to come back up again. And then also just the role of the media. Sometimes in disasters, people welcome the media attention because it brings in other resources, financial donations, attention from politicians, things like that. And it just shows people recognize that they went through something significant enough that it is kind of capturing the attention of the world. In other cases, that media presence can feel very intrusive. Someone, a journalist sticking a microphone in someone's face saying, "How do you feel having just been through this?" So that can be negative. And then this idea of kind of getting all of those reminders of the loss, that's also very, again, it sort of just keeps kind of reopening the wound. And the points about not being able to follow the funeral rituals, that for sure, even under non-COVID conditions, often disasters mean that maybe the bodies are not recovered, or they are not, maybe they've been burned, or, there's other reasons why often rituals can't be followed, or just the state of the area is so unsafe and disrupted, people can't travel there to participate in funerals and things like that. So that is just very painful, because, come back to that, because again, as I said before, that means not only are we deprived of that gathering of support for ourselves, but it also means we feel like we didn't do the service, the last way of honoring the person. Okay, I think I already basically talked about those, so I'm gonna skip those just to keep moving. Okay, so now I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the extreme reactions that we can see. As I said before, addressing these extreme reactions may be part of your job in your more typical role as a psychologist or mental health professional, not so much as a DMH helper, but just to kind of be aware of what those might be. So very quickly. All right, so as I said, most people will recover over time once the recovery environment has stabilized, once they feel safe again, once they feel connected again. So, generally the expectation is for recovery. It's interesting. I often ask when I'm training in person, after something like a major weather event, like a hurricane, what the rates typically of people who experience that and develop post-traumatic stress disorder are. For a natural event, it's typically around 5%. So around 1 in 20 people might go on to develop PTSD. And that's bad because it's a terrible condition. And we're looking at, large populations. So there still could be big numbers overall. But that also means 19 out of 20 people are likely to recover. There are higher rates for sure from human-caused disasters, very large-scale disasters, and especially things that were intentional, like a terrorist attack or a shooting, excuse me. But, the norm is recovery. However, even if people aren't going on to have clinical level post-traumatic stress disorder, they still could be suffering in the meantime. So, they still might not qualify for a diagnosis, but they still could benefit from some treatment. So, we want to think about this as just being aware of what those needs might be, but also not overestimating rates. So PTSD, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, so I'll just spend a moment on this. But basically, this is where someone has gone through a traumatic experience like a disaster, and basically the core issue is that they can't integrate that as something that is in the past. So that's why they have the re-experiencing symptoms, the vigilance, the negative alterations in mood, because they're waiting for it to happen again. They're always on guard. And I bet, I can't remember, I haven't seen specific rates for earthquakes, but because people genuinely do need to stay on guard, I'm sure it's higher than for other kinds of natural events. So basically, because each time you have that re-arousal, it's so distressing, you get into that habit of avoidance, and then that generalizes. So I'm sure we're all very familiar with that. And yeah, okay, so pretty much said all of this. So it is a terrible condition, and absolutely our goal should be to prevent people from developing it, or at the very least, recognizing it in the early stages, because as the second point says, the core symptoms tend to reinforce each other. They tend to make each other worse. So it gets harder and harder to treat as time goes on, and it becomes kind of more, a part of the person's functioning. But fortunately, cognitive behavioral therapies can be quite effective for it. So thinking about just referring someone to seek cognitive behavioral therapy if you're seeing signs that they seem to be having early PTSD symptoms or acute stress disorder. Complicated grief. This is not a formal diagnosis from the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. This, I think, is kind of going back to the points I was just making about how, for most people, yes, grieving is harder than we show it to be. It lasts a lot longer, but for most people, there is that kind of healing process, that healing around the missing piece, moving forward, starting to grow again. Some people just sort of never really start that recovery or adjustment process. They're often referred to as being kind of stuck in the very early stages of bereavement. And so these are people who certainly could benefit from some grief counseling, some bereavement counseling, just to hopefully get them unstuck. There's no time frame that's given for when you're supposed to be over a loss, because that's just not reality. But as long as there's kind of some forward motion, some process of improvement, people might not necessarily need professional help, although they still could potentially benefit from it. Substance abuse is interesting. The research in the US, at least, tends to find that there are not a lot of new cases of really serious misuse of alcohol or drugs as a response to disasters. Not none. I mean, some people might go through it and start self-medicating in that way, but it's much more likely that the people who use substances problematically after the event already had a problem before it. So, they were already at risk for abuse, or maybe they had a history of abuse and maybe they had gotten sober, but then they relapsed and started using again after the disaster. So, that's good in the sense that we don't usually have to worry about a whole lot of people starting to, become alcoholics or drug addicts in response specifically to a disaster. But we also want to recognize that those with that history are at high risk. And so, maybe building in, helping people reconnect with Alcoholics Anonymous or other 12-step programs or whatever had been kind of keeping their use under control before. All right, so wrapping up this section, as I keep saying, the goal of DMH is not treating that small percentage of people with the extreme reactions, but preventing them. So what we want to do is get in there as early as possible, once it is safe, for sure, and providing psychological first aid, which will be the next thing we'll talk about, and giving it to everyone just in the hopes of kind of, if we spread it throughout the entire impacted population, hopefully that will help the vast majority of people get back to that baseline much more quickly and really reduce the number who are going to go on to develop these lasting effects that are going to need more intensive treatment. All right. Let's see, how are we doing? Okay, actually, we are great on time. So let's, this is another kind of good point for a break, if people can use that. So why don't we, let's see, what time do I have? I have exactly 1 o'clock. Trying to think about the timing of this. Why don't we do another 8-minute break, and we'll come back at 1:08 for the last section of all of this when we really get into these interventions. Okay, I will see you at 1:08. Okay, hopefully everyone's back again for our final portion. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk about now is really what is the core of the core of disaster mental health response. And it's sort of, well, okay, I'll get into it in a second. But basically, we're going to look at psychological first aid primarily, because that's really the majority of the early interventions, especially shortly after disasters. And then I'll get some into some other early interventions and some self-care as well. So, I mean, first, just to point out why it is so important that we do focus on early intervention. And this is basically just going back to what I just said. We want to have this preventative approach. So, we probably can't prevent the disaster from occurring. Maybe we can convince people to follow warnings and have less of a bad experience with it. But, we're starting with the assumption people have experienced a disaster. And then often there's not only the trauma of that experience itself, where maybe they felt like their life was in danger, or they questioned the fairness of the world. Also, often people get these negative reactions, intentional or not. But, often people get they get blamed. People say, well, why didn't you follow the warning? We told you this was going to happen. Why didn't you do it? Or they feel like authorities are not looking out for their needs. We've had many examples of this in the US, especially under certain presidential administrations, of disaster survivors not getting all of the support that they should be getting for various political reasons. So, just that kind of sense of other people blaming you. And that's a control mechanism for the people doing the blaming. It's basically saying, well, it's their own fault. If they had just done what we had said, then they wouldn't have gotten in that situation. And therefore, I will never be in that situation because I wouldn't be so foolish to ignore the warning. So it's basically a way of sort of distancing ourselves from those survivors, because otherwise we have to acknowledge, wait, it could have been me. I could have been the one who went through this situation. And then there's also the self-talk. What does the person tell themselves? Are they saying, you shouldn't have been the one who survived, or you should have done something differently, or you should have rescued all those people? So there's both that kind of external message and then the internal voice in their head that's very problematic. So that's what we really want to be kind of addressing, not just what is that kind of internalized message that they have taken on, but also, what was their experience and what can we do about, just improving their treatment. And part of that is just being there and demonstrating that people care about them. People care what they went through and want to help them recover. So we always kind of want to have this position that people have the ability to recover, and we're going to be there to support that. We're not there to fix them. We're not there to cure them. We are there to kind of walk alongside them as that natural recovery starts to kick in and helps them get back to that baseline, whatever that was. So this is a kind of classic article. I encourage you to read this if you have not. It's now, 14 years old, but this is kind of the founding document in disaster mental health right now. So this was basically 20 international trauma and disaster experts looking at both their own clinical experiences, their response experiences, and then also looking at the literature. What has been studied empirically, what data are there? And they basically came up with this set of these core principles of early intervention, regardless of what the event was. But basically saying, the elements of our response need to include these 5 elements. So helping people feel safe again, as I've said over and over again. Unless that is there, we are going to stay in that fight or flight mode, and we can't concentrate on anything but survival. Promoting calm, just kind of bringing down the emotional level for everyone, which very much feeds into feeling safe again. Promoting sense of efficacy, that sense that, yes, I do have the ability to take charge of my own recovery, to help my community recover, that sense that I am able to change this situation. I am not just a passive victim of what is going on, which people often do feel in times of disaster. I mean, they feel disempowered, they feel out of control. So this is focused on helping them, remember that they have agency, they have the ability to help themselves. Promoting connectedness, as I keep saying, getting them back in touch with their sources of social support, and instilling hope, helping people feel, if they feel in despair, if they feel like it is always going to be this bad, what can you do to help them achieve a realistic hope? You can't encourage them to hope, oh, I hope my loved one who was killed magically comes back to life, or I hope the disaster that destroyed my home magically didn't happen. It's not that, obviously. It's, I hope that we can get to a stage where we feel safe again. I hope we can get to a point where we can rebuild and reclaim our lives again. Because without that hope, there's nothing to kind of keep us motivated, keep us going. So these are the 5 principles. And then psychological first aid is really kind of how we put these into action. So there's a lot of different definitions of psychological first aid, PFA, and this one's as good as any. But basically, I like this because it's saying it's evidence informed. So there's some research indicating it works. It's hard to research this because, as we'll see, the whole point is that you do it differently with each person. So it's not standardized in the way that you can do like a cognitive behavioral therapy. So we say evidence informed rather than evidence based. Pragmatically oriented, practically oriented. It is absolutely focused on, remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, targeting, I said before, if someone is cold and wet and hungry, until they get a blanket and something to eat and something to drink, they cannot think about anything else. So it's recognizing you got to really start with those baseline needs. We are looking at acute stress reactions. Again, we're not going back to your history of your relationship with your mother. We are looking at how you are feeling right now, having been through this disaster event. Immediate, and it can apply to everyone. So survivors and responders immediately after a disaster. Once again, as soon as it is safe to be there. Continuing this definition, so you can see this. It is very much in line with the Hobfall principles of safety, reducing stress symptoms, connections to resources. So there are different models of PFA, but kind of these are the core goals of all of them. Describing PFA, it is very short term. You may, I think I said this before, but you may literally have your only interaction with someone being handing them a bottle of water or asking if they know where they're going to sleep that night. You have to put everything you've got into that one interaction and make that the most beneficial and supportive that it possibly can be, because that might be your only chance to talk to this person. Now you might have more contact with them depending on the circumstances, but the assumption is always make the most of the moment in front of you, because that might be the only chance you have to help this person. It is absolutely, all these interrelated needs, again, Maslow's hierarchy. And as the third point says, the goal is removing barriers. I often use this analogy that when someone has been through a very stressful event, it often feels like, here's me and here's everything I need to do to recover, and here's a brick wall in between me and the future. And all I can see is the brick wall, because my brain is just, so caught up with trying to understand the new demands on me, what I have just been through, whatever. So it's like you cannot see through to the future. So part of how I think of psychological first aid is, as a helper, you can't probably take that brick wall away entirely, but what you might be able to do through these actions is start breaking that brick wall down into a bunch of separate piles of bricks. So the person themselves, the survivor, is still going to have to deal with each of those piles of bricks, but maybe they can start to see a path through them. And maybe they can start to say, okay, this brick, brick number one is figuring out where, or pile number one, where are we going to sleep tonight? The pile of dealing with my insurance company, that one's down the road. That is not urgent. So helping people prioritize, helping people just kind of break it down into manageable pieces so that they can start to take that control, start to take that role in their own recovery again. So I hope that makes sense. It's, I don't know, not a perfect analogy, but again, just kind of what can you do to help them get it into more manageable pieces? And then PFA is universal, meaning not only can you use it with anybody, but anyone can learn to use it as well. So even though you all are going to be using it probably at sort of a higher level with more insight as psychologists, as mental health professionals, you can train everyone in your community to use PFA with each other. And please do. There are trainings out there. Train your teachers in how to use it to help their students, train your first responders, everyone working in your hospitals. I'm a really firm believer that everyone should learn to do this. So how do we do it? Well, first of all, it's not a series of steps. It is not, it's not like cognitive behavioral therapy where you kind of follow the manual and you do certain things in a certain order. It's a toolkit. So you have a bunch of tools in your toolkit, and part of what your professional judgment will be is figuring out, okay, what needs to be fixed with this person? How can I help them do that by pulling out the right tool for this particular situation? And yeah, so there are different models of it. The one I'm going to teach you is the one that's used in New York State, but the Red Cross has a slightly different one. All sorts of different organizations do. They're all trying to accomplish the same thing. They use different language, have different numbers of elements. All right, so going through these steps in turn. First, and again, I'm going to say first, but it's not that you do this in this particular order, but always just being aware of you focusing on staying calm. You've all had professional training in this, probably won't be that difficult for you, but even recognizing, you might be great at staying calm, even with a very upset client in a one-on-one situation, but now imagine being in a disaster setting where maybe there were 500 people around you who are all very upset. So you need to just stay connected to your own sense of calm, because as we've all seen, these emotions are contagious. So if you're talking to someone who's very upset, often we start breathing like them and taking on their body language and their facial expressions. The opposite can be true as well. So if you can stay calm, stay focused, that often will really help to bring down their anxiety as kind of a starting point. Providing warmth or having an attitude of warmth and genuineness. You probably all studied Carl Rogers' Unconditional Positive Regard. So just that idea of, having the assumption that the person you are trying to help is not a broken person or a flawed or a person who failed at this disaster, but this is a human being who really through no fault of their own had this terrible experience, and now they're struggling to come to terms with it. And so I think this is very useful to think about. Remind yourself those roles could be reversed. It could just as easily be you who went through the disaster and they would be the person trying to help you. So how would you want to be treated? You would want to be treated with respect. You would want to be treated as someone who's capable of dealing with their situation. And just, part of it is simply just that staying focused, keeping that attention on them, not being distracted and that's hard to do if you're in a crowded setting and there's a lot of competing voices and things, but ties into staying calm, just, facing them directly, making eye contact, unless they're not comfortable with that. Some people aren't. But basically just, yeah, I mean, making it clear that you are there for them and you are open to whatever they want to tell you. This only works if it is genuinely genuine. You can't really fake this part of things. And so, you know, part of this, a lot of responders find that when they're starting to get overwhelmed themselves, starting to get burned out, this is often one of the first things that they struggle with. So feeling like, oh, God, I just cannot talk to another person. You know, when you lose that ability to connect with people at this level, that might be a sign that you need a break, you need to do more self-care, something like that. Certainly seeing to their physical needs, you know, helping them get out of a dangerous situation. And, you know, as I said before, when we have that fight or flight response go off, we're often not thinking very clearly. People, especially, you know, they're desperate to get back to their homes to see what the damage was. So they might want to go into a dangerous area or start digging through, you know, a collapsed building to find things. So trying to just encourage people to be physically safe, but also, you know, as I've said a million times now, helping them to feel emotionally safe as well. And that's hard because if they are still having the fight or flight kind of feedback, you know, reactivating itself, you can tell them a million times, it's over, it's done, you're safe, but the chemicals in their body are saying, no, you're in danger still. And those chemicals are a lot more powerful than anything you can say. So this can be really tricky and you know, it can take a while. And once again, with earthquakes, you can't promise it's over. You can't promise there's not going to be another aftershock. So that really sort of undermines your ability to help, you know, to pursue this one of helping them feel safe. And that's difficult, I know. Just, you know, figuring out what do they need physically. I think this is all kind of obvious. The last point, especially if people are maybe not able to be in their homes, to just encourage, especially if you have families with children or older adults with them, encouraging people to just follow routines, have that stability, you know, try and eat dinner at the same time you usually eat dinner. If you read your kids a book before they go to sleep at night, tell them a story, even if you don't have a book available, you know, whatever it can be to just, especially for young children, give them some sense of normalcy, of stability, because they've lost that and that's very upsetting. So trying to return to that as much as possible. The problem solving, I mean, this kind of goes back to the, yeah, sleep is terribly difficult for people who, you know, they can't fall asleep. They have dreams where they're experiencing it again. And then of course, when you're not sleeping well, everything else is terrible. You know, you're exhausted, you have less ability to think clearly. So that's definitely a huge problem always. Yeah, so this kind of goes back to the pile of bricks part. You know, because people are just so overwhelmed, someone might normally be able to make a decision easily or think about other options or whatever, and they just can't right now. So you might need to kind of step in and help them with that, you know, breaking it down into smaller decisions, framing it as maybe two options, you know, not just asking them to come up with a new idea, but saying, well, could you do this or could you do this? You know, is this better for you or is this better for you? So just kind of simplifying things. And, you know, you might be a little more directive than you normally would be in a role as a counselor. You know, you still always want the person to be involved in their own decisions, but you might need to kind of frame it a little more specifically for them. What I just said, yeah, but always, you know, you never want to be telling them what to do because it's part of that sense of efficacy for them to relearn, okay, yes, I do have the ability to make decisions. I have a very experienced colleague who worked with the Red Cross for many, many years. And she taught me the lemonade rule, which is basically, don't just hand someone a bottle of water, but say, do you want water or do you want lemonade? Or do you want water or coffee? Or do you want one bottle of water or two bottles of water? Because that forces them to make a decision. You know, it's a tiny decision that nothing happens if they choose wrong in some way, but it just activates that sense that they're not just passively receiving the help people are giving them. They can actually say, oh yeah, I want this, I don't want that. So it's a tiny trick, but it actually works pretty well. Validation, I mean, just, you know, acknowledging that people have been through something difficult. And this goes back to what I said before, where people will compare themselves to others. And sometimes they'll say, oh, I know it wasn't that bad, so I shouldn't complain, or I shouldn't be upset about this. Or they'll say, what is my neighbor complaining about? You know, I'm sorry they lost their dog, but my entire house is gone. So, you know, you can kind of, people can get into sort of both sides of this comparison. Still just, you know, your loss is your loss, and you deserve to be upset about that. You might not want to be quite as loudly upset about it in front of someone who did have significantly worse losses, but it still doesn't mean you don't have the right to mourn the things you have lost. Okay, yeah, so basically, same point I already made, you know, if you pretend it didn't happen or it's not bothering you, at some point that's going to resurface again. I'm sure we all know. I talked about media before. You know, it's not all bad. Some people want to talk to media, talk to journalists. Some absolutely don't. So you might help people kind of figure out what are the consequences if you decide to do an interview, especially now knowing that's going to be sort of on the record forever. But not all bad by any means, but helping people think through. So this is an important one. Expressing empathy and opening up a situation where people can talk about what they went through, that is very good. But we learned, the whole mental health field learned, we used to use, I don't know if this will translate, but critical incident stress debriefings, which were basically for emergency responders who went through a very difficult response in their work. We sort of encourage them to talk about it, to share what they went through. That was done a lot after the attacks of September 11, 2001. We basically learned from that not only is it not always helpful for people to talk about their traumatic experience, but for some people in some timing, it's actually harmful for them to do that. Sometimes people have to just be focusing on getting through what's next. They don't have the ability to open up those feelings at this point. For others, they might hear other people's stories and feel traumatized by what they're feeling beyond what their own story was. So basically, you don't want to encourage people to talk if they are not ready to. And if they are ready to talk, you want to make sure you're in an appropriate setting. You want to make sure that, like, you are all mental health professionals, so it's probably fine for people to talk to you. If you've trained, the non-professionals in your community, you want to train them to make a referral to you when someone is ready for this stage. And if they are ready for it, you have to be there with them from the start to the finish, and really taking on what they're telling you. Again, you've all had training in this as professionals, so I'm less worried about you guys taking on this role than non-professionals. But just to think, going through that with someone, and maybe going through that with a whole lot of people who went through the disaster, just being aware of the toll that it could take on you. And just to be conscious of how are you leaving them at the end. You never want to get someone into a state where they are, certainly not re-experiencing or even just confronting those strong emotions and then say, okay, well, our time is over. I have to leave now. Obviously, you want to get them back so they are calmed down again, hopefully leaving them not alone, but connecting them with whatever social support they might have around them, giving them referral information for a follow-up if having had that conversation now is opening up other things they need to talk about. Again, you're professionals, but just being aware, do that in a responsible way. So I've talked a lot about social support. So the only thing I'll say here is I find it useful to point out the difference between, so instrumental support is practical things. Is there someone who can watch your kids tomorrow so you can go and see what condition your house is in? Is there someone you can go and stay with so you don't have to stay in a shelter? That's sort of the things that people need, the practical things people need. That's very different in some ways than emotional support. You might have someone in your life who you would be perfectly happy to, have babysit your kids for the afternoon so you can go do what you need to do. That might not be the person you want to open up to emotionally, to tell your story to seek comfort from. You might have people who are in your lives who are different in those roles. Same with informational support. Who can tell you what to do? Who can give you advice? Who can give you guidance? I just like to point that out because if you recognize you need one form of support, but you ask the wrong person for that, then you're likely to be disappointed. It might not work out very well. It might backfire on you in some way. So just, when you're encouraging people who to reach out to, say, okay, is this someone, you need some emotional support right now? Is your sister a person you can really open up to? Or is there any risk that, they're gonna let you down, or even worse? Certainly, obviously, reuniting physically for sure. We also want to recognize that some relationships are not supportive. So, if your sister is not going to validate you and help you process your emotions, but is going to blame you and tell you this was your fault, then we want to think about maybe not doing that. So, always think of it. Sometimes we say, like, someone might resist reaching out because they don't want to be a burden. They don't want to ask people for things. They want to be independent. In those cases, it can be helpful to say, well, okay, if the roles were reversed, wouldn't you want your sister to reach out to you? Sometimes that will convince people to do it if it's just that, they don't want to trouble other people. But also remember, there might be a very real reason why they don't want to reach out to that particular person. They know better than you do. So, you might push a little bit, but respect their decision for sure. All right, information is so key. This is beyond the physiological, the food, water, shelter. I think that this is probably the most important thing that people need, because disasters are new experiences for most people. They're unfamiliar. So getting information can be very comforting. It can help with that sense of efficacy, of agency, of regaining control. However, sometimes that information simply is not available, or the situation is changing so rapidly. So this can be really tricky, like trying to balance putting information out as soon as possible, but not so soon that it turns out not to be true, because then if you do that, people don't trust you any longer. The pandemic was a classic example of this. So much misinformation, or, often it wasn't, or it usually wasn't intentional. It was just that we didn't know. At the beginning, we didn't know how it was spread. So we spent a lot of time washing our hands rather than covering our faces in masks. Disasters are always going to be changing. And so that's tricky. Just, how can you kind of, reassure people you are getting them the best information possible? Because if you don't, rumors will start spreading. If people are not feeling like they're getting believable information from authorities, they will turn to non-authorities. They will turn to social media, to the internet, to their neighbor who doesn't really know anything. So that's a real danger that you want to be watching out for as well. Again, just, what resources can be made available to people, keeping messaging simple, giving a backup in writing, or, even I've seen shelters starting to do things like having like a message area where they post things in writing and people can then just take a picture of it with their phone so they can take it with them. Because as I said, people aren't thinking as clearly, so they're not likely to remember a lot of what you're telling them. So repeating it, giving it in writing, that's always helpful. And yeah, as I said, you never want to give out unconfirmed information, or, you might be in a situation where you know something that you're not authorized, maybe because someone has died and their family has not been notified yet. So you absolutely should not give out information that it's not your role to. All right, so education, psychoeducation, this is another great part of PFA, just this idea of, I said this before, it makes sense you're feeling this way. Literally giving people, a handout that shows those 5 realms of reactions and the reactions over time. Anything that just helps them not feel crazy, not feel like there's something wrong with them, that normalizes it, again, without saying it's normal. But, this is really key. And, again, it makes sense that you're feeling this way and you will likely feel better. Even just that small thing is really comforting for a lot of people. It's also great to help people figure out, okay, I'm having these reactions, how am I going to deal with them? So talking to them about what are effective coping mechanisms, we usually describe that as things that you can do to deal with your stress that helps you feel better, but also helps you function better, helps you deal with it realistically, as opposed to ineffective ones that might help you feel better or just feel less in general. Drugs and alcohol, for example. But those are things that don't help you actually function. They don't help you confront, deal with those piles of bricks that you still need to deal with. This can be tricky because it can seem very unrealistic sometimes. I mean, if someone has lost their home and you're saying, this would be a great time to start doing yoga or to quit smoking or something like that. I mean, yes, those would be good things for them, but this is not the time or place to do that. So you want to kind of keep it realistic, and you want to, again, just kind of recognize what people want to hear and what they don't need to hear at this point. This is what I just said. Yeah, so again, being aware of just things like smoking too much, drinking too much, drugs, being overly controlling, trying to run the situation for everyone around you, bullying other people, not taking breaks. It's all the stuff we know we should be doing. Eating well. Okay, here's some examples. So these are all good things that we know we should be doing. These are hard enough to do in non-disaster times. So you just kind of be cautious on these. Although these are great things for you as well, for your own self-care. Some of the ineffective ones, yeah, so just kind of cautioning people away from these. And especially because the ineffective ones can become habits very, very quickly. So someone might think, okay, I'm just going to have a couple of drinks tonight so that I can sleep for once. But that can easily become, more and more used to a point where it becomes problematic. So just cautioning people not to get into these bad habits in the first place. That's a lot easier than breaking them once they're established. So bringing this all together, basically, again, you just want to remember that idea, get them back to baseline. Anything beyond that, any growth beyond that is awesome, but that is not part of disaster mental health. Once again, we need to treat everyone individually, and we need to recognize that some people don't want to talk to a mental health professional. They've got their own resources, or they're just not in a place where they can deal with their emotions at all. Hopefully they will down the road before, something like PTSD occurs. But we respect that. We're not going to force our services on anyone. Very briefly, just a few things beyond PFA that you might incorporate into your disaster work. So I'll talk about each of these. So I've talked about this a bunch previously, some of those misperceptions about what you really could have done. And then afterwards, just, what is the story you tell yourself? What is the judgment that you're passing on yourself? And people who've been through something traumatic often will blame themselves unrealistically, or they'll make these really broad overgeneralizations. So, yes, the disaster happened. Yes, you were in danger once. That does not mean you are in danger all the time. Yes, maybe someone intentionally hurt you or your family, and some people can't be trusted. That doesn't mean no one can be trusted and that everyone is terrible. So, just kind of trying to figure out through conversation, what are the voices in this person's head telling them? How realistic is that? And what might you be able to do to minimize some of that judgment? But recognizing also that, you can't say, no, it wasn't your fault if they did have some responsibility in the decisions that they made. If you say to someone, if someone says, this is my fault because I got the warning to evacuate and I didn't, and my family suffered because of that. You can't say it wasn't your fault, you couldn't have known, because they could have known. And so they won't believe you if you try and just erase that entirely. Instead, what you can do is say, okay, well, let's talk about why you made the decision you made. What did you know about how likely it was that the storm was going to hit on that day? Did you know where you were going to be able to go? Did you know how much that was going to cost you? Did you know how long you would have to be away? Did you know how upsetting that would be for your kids? Could you take your pets? So it's really just helping them figure out, okay, I made a rational decision based on the information I had at the time. It turned out not to be the best decision. So what can I do in the future so that next time I'll make a better decision? You're not going to take all of their guilt away, but hopefully you can at least kind of reduce it some, so they're not just punishing themselves or feeling shame about it, but instead making it into something a little more productive. Talked about this already, but rumors, when people don't feel they're getting the information they need, they will essentially make it up. And of course now social media people can always find, information consistent with what they believe or what they suspect, even if what they suspect is actually increasing their fear and their distress. If you find something that tells you, yeah, this is going to be even worse, or whatever, whatever the rumor might be about, that's almost comforting in a way, because it's saying, oh, no wonder I feel this upset. It's because this reality is different than what the authorities are telling me. So it's almost like a way of justifying the extreme reactions people are having. So you want to really be on the lookout for these rumors that are spreading in your community, rumors that are spreading through social media, and just, get on top of them, try and counter them, not just by saying, no, that's not accurate, but by going into what is the accurate information. This is not correct because whatever. Instead, this is another thing that's sort of easier said than done. Once a rumor gets out there, it's a lot harder to kind of bring it back and cancel it than in the first place. So just kind of being out there, being conscious of this, because it is a real problem. All right, another thing you might get involved in, especially if you have people in a setting like a shelter or another kind of community area, there's often this sense, and it's often real in times of disaster, that there aren't enough resources. And so there's competition for those resources. And that then makes people feel very anxious. And then that can lead to conflict. So, who should get the COVID vaccine first? Who should get the food supplies? It's just whatever the immediate need is going to be. Once people get into that sense of it's me versus them, that is likely, especially if there were already tensions between maybe different racial or ethnic groups in a community, or neighbors who already were in a fight with each other or whatever. So this can definitely cause conflict. And often that conflict is, like the anger, is directed at the helpers. So just being prepared for that. And you've probably had some conflict resolution experience or training, but that's a great thing to seek out if you haven't. I think all of this is pretty obvious, but yeah, just kind of keeping an eye, and better to step in sooner. And that might mean separating people. If you see two residents of a shelter starting to get heated with each other, starting to get in an argument, you can go over and say, come get a cup of coffee with me, and literally physically separate them. That's not going to guarantee that might not happen again when they're back in each other's presence, but just kind of divide and conquer, just kind of whatever you can do to minimize that. Certainly being aware of what referral options are out there is important. You are going to be focusing on people's short-term needs, but knowing what is out there for them, for the people who either self-identify or who you recognize seems to really be struggling and who you think it would be a good idea for. Some people are not going to be receptive to that for sure, but just know what those resources are in your community. Is there a cost for them? Yeah, just kind of all of these details, and that's very situation specific. So just things to think about being aware of. And some people are not going to want to pursue more intensive mental health care, either because of that stigma, they feel like, nope, that's not for me. Or people know that if they are going to get treatment for trauma, they're going to have to confront the traumatic memory. And of course, the nature of PTSD is the avoidance is such a key part of it. So, it's really hard for people with PTSD to engage in treatment and stick with it. But if they do, they can get cured, not just improved, but they can actually have the PTSD cured entirely. So obviously we want to be really supportive of people who are willing to do that, while acknowledging it's not easy to do for sure. All right, fine on time, few more points. These are, I'm sure you're all familiar with these, but these are the treatments for PTSD in particular. They can also have good effectiveness for anxiety, some forms of depression, some forms of substance use as part of the overall treatment. But basically all the cognitive behavioral therapies. And then, medication can play a role, hopefully sort of short term, if it's just in order to help people control their symptoms enough to participate in the cognitive behavioral therapy that can cure them, so they can then get off of the medication, ideally. All right, so my last point in our last few minutes is just taking care of yourself. And this is something we all know we need to do. We all probably feel we should do a better job at. Maybe some of you are great at it. If so, I'm very impressed. As much as I tell other people to do it, I'm not always the best at it myself. I recognize that. But, getting involved in disaster response work, there's often a lot of satisfaction from it. You know, it is very empowering to know that we actually can help people who are going through a terrible time in their lives. So there's the sort of direct gratification, just like literally knowing I had a conversation with someone and they left that conversation feeling better about their situation, feeling like it's building our skills. You know, and having just a break from routine work, you know, break from whatever your normal patterns are. I don't know what insurance forms are like there, but, you know, just getting away from paperwork and all of the routine stuff. Certainly, there's a real strong pattern of responders bonding with each other. It's almost like, you know, serving in the military together. Like, we went through this super intense experience. We really looked out for each other and protected each other. So that can be very rewarding for people. And just, again, this sense that I can do something. You know, when we hear about a disaster, I think most people want to help. And maybe the only way they can do that is donating money or goods or things like that. But we actually have skills that we can use. So that's a privilege. But we also want to be very conscious of the cost of that, the toll it can take, because, you know, it really is essential that we don't view self-care during these responses as something that's a luxury, that's always the last thing on the list, that people are going to think, you know, we're being selfish if we do this. It's the opposite of that. It's a professional responsibility, because if you're not taking care of yourself, you are not going to be able to take care of other people effectively. And you might even reach a point where you're harming them unintentionally, but where, you know, you are not exercising your professional judgment and skills. So of course, that's the last thing anybody wants. So just these hazards get described in a few different ways. Burnout is not really specific to mental health. Any field you can get burned out in, that's just, you've just done it too much. I think we all have COVID-19 burnout right now, for sure. It's where you're just sick of it. You just need a break. Compassion fatigue is more specific to the helping professions. So this is basically where you've just given too much, and to the point where you have, you know, you are helping everyone else, not helping yourself, to the point where you just have nothing left to give. And that can be really distressing for helpers, because you can reach a point where you just feel like, I don't care anymore. And if part of your personality, part of your, you know, your identity is, I am a person who helps others, and you reach this point where you don't care about helping others, that's a real significant blow. So definitely need to step back and take care of yourself. And then a little bit different, vicarious trauma is when the helper takes on the emotions of the person that they are helping. So you're hearing their story of what they went through, and you are not only feeling empathy, that you can understand what that is probably like for them, but you are feeling those feelings with them, sympathy. And that is a quick way to get overwhelmed and not be able to help people. And then also, you know, the physical concerns, you know, as I said, we should not be responding if it's a dangerous situation, but you don't know with earthquakes. We have a lot of mental health people here who responded to 9/11 and got exposed to the chemicals in the air and the smoke, and now are getting cancer because they responded on the mental health side, and it's now 20 years later. So that's just another thing to be conscious of, and we can't always predict what that's going to be. I'm actually going to skip that just because we're almost out of time. But basically just, you know, again, last point, just this is hard to do under normal times. So you really need to plan for this, because if you have a self-care plan, it's a lot easier to follow that plan than to come up with it while you're in the stress and the strain of a response. And I think, okay, these are again, all the things that we know we should all be doing. So you can review these in the slides. And again, just recognizing with self-care, what works for some people might not work for you. That's fine. If yoga is not your thing, no problem. Find something that is and make sure you do it. And that, I'm going to actually skip this as well. Here are some resources. We have some tip sheets. We have a bunch of videos. We have some other trainings that you can find that we've done on various topics. So you'll have all of this. And basically, if anyone has any questions, I know we are right at the end of our time. I can't believe I nailed it exactly at 2 o'clock, but I hope this was helpful. I really admire the work that you are all trying to do. Again, very much hope when things calm down again that I can come and visit all of you and see your beautiful country. But take care of yourselves, and you can always email if you have further questions or anything like that. My colleague, Amy, is going to be doing 2 more workshops on Wednesday. So I'm sure Igor and Ella will share those with everyone. Some of those are more for a general audience. So one is on psychological first aid again, so you don't need that part so much, but another one is on supporting children and families. So that might be very helpful for you. So, all right, thank you all, everyone. And yeah, we'll get the slides to Igor and Ella, and I wish you all the best. Take care, everyone.